Right. Well, it is a great privilege to be here this morning. It's Glasgow Business Week, I understand, and I've been roped in at the last minute to speak to you on legal issues to do with funding. I realise that this is going to be on YouTube, so for my wife, I forgot my wedding ring. I apologise. And I am growing a goatee. Go to Movember/Philip Haney. Please donate. Okay. As a way of introduction, I see I'm on a wee bit of a platform here. It reminds me of when Socrates stood on Mars Hill in Athens and addressed the crowds. He started his discourse by saying, "If there's one thing I know, it is that I know nothing." And being invited here this morning to speak on corporate finance, I might as well have started, "I know nothing." But I think he meant that when you start to think about a subject, it gets deeper and deeper. You realise that you know so little. And over the years, I think raising finance has become slightly more complicated. Not only has the vehicles for setting up in business changed, not only has the sources of finance changed, but the criteria has changed as well. And so I don't actually have a planned speech, so I thought what I'd do is just speak briefly on business vehicles, and then I would speak on perhaps sources of finance, and then some of perhaps the regulation of that, because as a lawyer, the tools of my trade are risk and regulation, and that's really what it's about, being a lawyer, analysing the risk for a client, and then being able to tell them about the regulation that may apply. So in terms of business vehicles, can I just take a quick poll here in terms of who is a sole trader? Anybody? Sole trader? Who is in a partnership? Who's limited company? Excellent. Who's a PLC? Maybe a bigger one. Okay, so there's a spread here, because there is obviously, if you're setting up in business, this is Glasgow Business Week, and I thought there might be some people here who are setting up in business, and the first decision you might want to make is, what business vehicle do I choose? Now, going as a sole trader, obviously it's quite straightforward in terms of you can just commence trading. I guess the risks associated with that is, the big risk is you're going to be personally liable for any wrongdoing. The liability basically sticks with you. In terms of moving on to a partnership, there's a chance to get together and form into a legal entity, which can be useful. But you have joint and several liability as well. And I'm sure those of you who set up as limited companies, or private limited companies, limited with shares, you probably understood that there's a huge advantage of a limited company is a separate legal person, and therefore it can be sued and sue, and therefore you are protected. You have a liability shield to an extent. Now, there is an exception to that, but that's just the general rule. There is a big advantage to setting up as a limited company because of the limited liability, but there's downsides as well. So what's the downsides? Downside for a sole trader may be, as I said, your personal liability. You might not want your house at risk. You might not want your personal assets at risk. The same may apply for a partnership, but obviously there's a buffer there in terms of the capital which has been put in to establish that partnership. But really the downsides for the company limited by shares is that you get what's called the administrative burden. And the administrative burden really can be summarised as you have to file accounts every year, accounts which be filed at a public register that people can find and people can know how your business is doing. And obviously those accounts have to be prepared by accountants. And you have to speak to the likes of Simon, which can be quite depressing. But you speak to a good accountant and they will put you right and they'll put your accounts in order. The other administrative hurdle that you face on a yearly basis is you have to file your return to Companies House, and yet again that can disclose where you live. And for internet-based businesses and businesses which are starting up, perhaps are hot desking and things like this, then that might be a problem, because you don't want to disclose your home address. You don't want anybody you owe money to come into your door and chapping that. So there is advantages and disadvantages to each of the different vehicles that you can take, and that's just 3 of the legal vehicles that you can proceed in business. There's obviously, there's sets within a set, and you can have a limited company. You could have a private limited company limited by shares, as I've discussed, which is quite popular. You could have a company limited by guarantee, so it doesn't have a share capital. And from working with the charities and creative industries, a lot of the creative industries actually go for that sort of route, a company limited by guarantee, because it seems more in line with their plans as a not-for-profit. And so there's the possibility of a company limited by guarantee. Then there's the public limited company, a company that perhaps has to have a share capital of £50,000 or wants to go to the market to raise money. And so there's those other structures in terms of limited companies. There's a limited liability partnership, which is a recent creation. There's a limited partnership. And soon coming, there'll probably be the single European company, which is coming down the line, whereby you can have a company, the jurisdiction of which is throughout the whole of Europe, and there's a lot of discussions happening at European level on that. So in terms of sources of finance, once you've chosen, okay, what's right for me? You know, do I need to employ people? Am I going to really be dealing in huge sums of money, and is there a lot of risk involved? Or am I just happy to basically carry on a trade, take the money, file a personal tax return, and keep everything nice and private and confidential? Well, sources of finance, I thought to myself, well, where would you go to? You could go to, first of all, you could go and look for grant money. And Glasgow Business Week, I'm sure this week there'll be presenters here at the Business Banter Breakfast Network, that there will be some people coming to tell you about sources of grant funding, perhaps RSA grants, which are available, and that's if you're setting up in a particular area and you're looking to employ people and regenerate an area, then there's government support there. Perhaps it's just if you're a young person, Prince's Trust, for example, if you're under 30, you might be able to access money. It used to run, they don't do this anymore, we used to run £1,000 in your hand, and so there are schemes constantly available. The Cultural Enterprise Office, if you're a creative industry person, creative thinker, then you could go there, and they have support, and they have programs you can go through to pitch for up to £10,000. And so grant funding and support through the public sector is one option. Then you could call up your friends, if you have any. You could ask them, you know, can you support me in my enterprise? Family, for example, and that's generally bootstrapping finance. You're raising the money yourself, you're talking to the people you know, you're bringing in those sources, and that's another way to bring money into your company. You could go to your bank and speak to the RBS this morning, good presentation. Obviously they can offer you overdraft, they can offer you term loans, and if you're a limited company, you might be able to secure money by way of giving a floating charge, which is a charge over the assets of a business of a limited company. So just bear that in mind when you're choosing your vehicle. And so there's all these different routes to gain finance. And then you could go to the private investors. If you're very, very clever, and some of you look very clever here this morning because I'm looking around and I see a lot of clever people, you could go to, and with your business plan, you could go and say, look, I've got this great idea, and if you give me £10, you know, in 10 years I'll give you £20. That might not get any support, but if you have a greater idea, then you might be able to access some private investment. Okay, so there's different sources of finance available, and I'm sure your bank, your banker, your accountant, your lawyer, your professional advisors will be able to run you through these more fully. So what happens? You've chosen your vehicle. Perhaps you've found people that are willing to invest in your company. What happens then? And that's really coming back to regulation. You have to regulate that. And in every level I see regulation. You might not acknowledge it, but we were hearing about a business plan. Now, even if you're a sole trader, I would advise you, and you ought to have a business plan. And that is a way of regulating your activities. That's a way of having some form of constitutional document, some form of vision, something that you're working towards that you can benchmark yourself and be held accountable at some level. That translates, if we go to set up a limited company or a partnership, for example, you need a partnership agreement. That's a way to regulate a partnership. And you know, it'll cover the same sort of areas as a business plan, really. Who's involved? Where's the money, the initial money coming from? What's going to happen in terms of profits? And so it will regulate these different areas. Then if you're a limited company, yes, you'll have a business plan. You won't have a partnership agreement. Does anybody know what you may have? Make sure you're still awake. A form of agreement that might regulate a limited company? No, well, you would a shareholders agreement. And so the people who originally set up the agreement would have an agreement amongst themselves in terms of what can the directors do. For example, if I was to invest into a limited company and put £50,000 in, and you were a director, and you said, thanks very much, Philip, and you had the authority to go and sign a cheque and buy a new car, and I see you driving up the street next day, and you fancy a car, I could say, well, wait a minute, that's not fair. I've invested in your company, you said it was a great idea, but you've taken my money. So my money was at risk, and it wasn't fully regulated, so I'd want to regulate that sort of arrangement. And so you'd have things like signing authority for cheques. You'd want to speak to your banker. You want to say, by the way, before you cash a cheque, you have to have these authorised signatories sign off on the cheque. And so there's things like that for you to consider. My mouth's getting a bit dry. I don't know if it's still sounding so great. So in terms of shareholders agreements, partnership agreements, business plans, there's ways to regulate each structure and keep everybody in line and everybody going towards that goal. And what is that goal? I guess you're in business to make money, because if you're not, it's just a hobby. Okay, so there's just an introduction to business vehicles. It's an introduction to perhaps source of finance, and just something to go away and think about how you're regulating the interaction between your business vehicle and the people who are putting money in. Just as an additional thought, just to go away, when you do receive finance, if it's a grant support, if it's a loan from your bank, if it's a private investor who's putting money in, typically there'll be some form of instrument between the two of you. It'll be a contract, okay? The bank documentation is, in fact, a contract. The shareholders agreement is a private contract. You'll end up entering into a contract, okay? And just to give you a top tip to go away this morning to think about is, I always say to people, think about the 3 Ps, okay? I don't mean what you've got on your plate for dinner at night. The 3 Ps, price, property, and parties. And what I mean by that is, who are the parties to this contract? And that will come back to your vehicle. Is it you personally? Is it my company? Who's contracting here? And it's very important, if you are talking to a private individual who's going to invest in your company, to do your diligence to find out who it is. What happens if they're undesirable? Do you want that PR, etc., etc.? So think about the parties, okay? Think about the price, the amount of money that you want from them, because that will have to be, is it deferred consideration? Is there milestones? Is it, I will give you X amount if you do Y, and then I'll give you another amount if you do Z, and so on and so forth. And so there's different ways to arrange your money, okay? And then, so think about the price, think about the parties, think about the price, think about the property, think about the service, think about the product that you're selling or the service you're going to render. And generally, these 3 things will exist in every contract, whether it's a shareholders agreement, whether it's a loan with the bank, whether you're contracting with somebody, whether you're getting somebody to design a website or a logo, no matter what it is, these 3 things are very key areas for you to look at in a contract. And that's a good bit of advice for you to take away this morning. So I'm happy to take questions right now, if anyone's got any.